Hello, in this video I'll explain what you need to know about A2.1, Origins of Cells. Alright, so this section's a little different than everything else we do in biology because it's about things that happened a long time ago, billions of years ago. And so we can't know for sure what happened because no one was there to witness it. So this is really about suggesting plausible hypotheses, things that seem possible based on what we know today for how life began on Earth, and suggesting the stages that may have occurred that seem reasonable based on the evidence that we have. So the first thing to know is what was the early Earth like? What was the atmosphere like before life formed? There's a few key points here. One is there was very little or almost no oxygen, and that had a lot of impacts. And there were higher concentrations of CO2 and methane as well. And we know this because of the evidence that we see in rocks, basically. We know that the atmosphere was very low in oxygen because it reacted with iron in the rocks, making iron oxide. We also know that it was high in methane and CO2, and that methane and CO2 would have come from the volcanic eruptions, of which there were a lot more of at that time. Since there was no oxygen, that means there was no ozone. So ozone is a chemical that forms in the atmosphere from oxygen. And it's important on Earth today because it absorbs UV light. And so without the ozone, we would have had a lot more UV light hitting the Earth's surface. And if that was happening today, that would be a bad thing because UV light is harmful. But we believe that in the prebiotic Earth, it actually provided the energy for the formation of carbon compounds. And it's thought that maybe these formed in the atmosphere where there was a lot of water vapor, and that maybe these compounds fell down into lakes and seas on the Earth, and over time the first cells formed from those carbon-based compounds. So before we get into how life formed, we should consider what life is. And to consider that, we also want to consider what life isn't. So you do need to be aware that viruses are thought to be non-living and to be able to explain why. So living things, we can discuss them in many ways. You've probably heard of things like Mrs. Gren and so on. But the key points here in this section are to describe living things as self-sustaining. So they're able to maintain themselves using energy. So all living things do this. They use energy and they maintain this highly organized state, which is not really a natural thing in the universe where things tend to become more and more disorganized. This is this concept of entropy. So living things work against entropy, and they use energy to sustain a more organized, a very organized, very complex condition. And they're able to pass that state on to offspring. So that's sort of the second characteristic of living things. If we try to consider, okay, what is the smallest unit of life, the smallest thing that we can consider to be living, we would say it's a cell, because cells are the smallest things that are self-sustaining and use energy to organize themselves, and that can divide and reproduce and pass on their ability through their genetic information to their offspring. Now, viruses, we would usually say, are not self-sustaining because they can't maintain their organized state on their own. They're also not capable of reproducing without a host cell. So it's sort of this idea that they can't maintain their state, they can't replicate on their own. they require a host cell, that we consider them not to be alive. So today, um, life forms don't form spontaneously, but at some point in the past, they would have had to have formed spontaneously. The first life forms had to come from non-life. And it's very challenging to explain how that is possible because no one's ever actually created life from non-life yet. So when we try to explain this spontaneous origin of life, and we're talking about cells, like the smallest thing that could be considered alive, it's sort of done by thinking about, okay, well, what would have to be true? And there's these different processes that would have to happen, like catalysis and self-replication, and the formation of a separate compartment. So getting into this a little bit more, let's just start with spontaneous generation. It's the idea that life forms from non-living matter, and it was once thought to be true that that's happening all the time now in the modern world. So not so long ago, people believed, based on their observations of things they were seeing in the environment, that life could form from non-living things. This was based on things like food going moldy, or some soup getting full of bacteria, or flies suddenly appearing on meat that was out for too long. And so they would observe these things of life seemingly like appearing out of nothing, and they assumed that life could spontaneously appear from basically the air. Um, it's been shown that that's not true. So Louis Pasteur is a famous example. There are others as well, who falsified this idea through experimentation. Now, I don't think you need to know Louis Pasteur's experiment in detail. You can see it there in the diagram. It is in your textbook. It was in the old curriculum, but it's not specifically discussed in the new curriculum. So I think you can just be aware of it, but not get into all the details. So even though spontaneous generation has been falsified, it doesn't happen normally, it still must have happened once, because there was a time when there was no life and now there is life. So how did that transition occur? And so the idea is certain things would have had to have occurred for life to emerge spontaneously. First, we would have need the molecules of life. We're calling those carbon compounds. Sometimes I call them organic molecules or biological molecules. We're talking about amino acids that are used to make proteins, nucleotides used to make DNA and RNA, phospholipids, things like that, the chemicals of life. And we'll look at an experiment that showed that this is indeed possible, the Miller-Urey experiment. It's also thought that that those carbon compounds would have had to have formed polymers. So you'll remember that a lot of the biological molecules are polymers. They're made of repeating units of similar or the same things, like carbohydrates and proteins, and DNA and RNA. They're all polymers. And so these carbon compounds would have had to have assembled into polymers to make life possible. We would have need some way to catalyze chemical reactions so that we can control those chemical reactions. Today, cells use proteins, enzymes, and there's numerous enzymes that control all the various steps of cell metabolism, cell respiration, protein synthesis, photosynthesis. Everything that a cell does is controlled using enzymes. And so it's thought that we would have had to have some means of control for life to emerge. The world was quite a violent environment, and it would have been very difficult for polymers to form and complex molecules that could catalyze chemical reactions to work just out in the open. So it's thought there had to be, at some point, the creation of separate compartments, you might call it a cell or a protocell or a vesicle, some kind of compartmentalization to create a separate environment that's separate from the outside environment so that the molecules of life could be protected and could start to evolve. Lastly, a key trait of life is self-replication. And so it's thought there had to be some molecule that could replicate itself and be passed from parent to offspring. And if that became possible, then we can see that natural selection would be possible. Maybe some of those replicating molecules would be more successful than others. They would increase in the population over time, and that would start to lead to this process of evolution where we'd get small changes over time, and these things that ultimately became cells would become increasingly successful at reproducing over time. So looking at evidence for a few of those things. So those are the just based on sort of logical thinking, those are the things we think must have occurred. So do we have any evidence that those things are indeed possible? We do for some of them. So for most of them. So the Miller-Urey experiment is quite famous as it showed that it was possible that carbon compounds could form just if in the conditions that we think existed in the early atmosphere. So this is Miller and Urey's experiment. They basically set up a model of the early atmosphere, and they put what they thought was in the early atmosphere. So they put methane in there, that's CH4. They put ammonia, NH3, hydrogen gas, H2, and water vapor, H2O, in a chamber. They had water boiling and condensing, and so the water was cycling through. And they would send electric sparks through this atmosphere, this collection of gases, to represent lightning. And so it's like a simplified model of the early atmosphere. And then they would cool the water vapor down, this sort of gaseous mixture. They'd cool it down by passing it through a condenser, and so it would turn into a liquid. And then they would collect little samples of this liquid every so often. And they let this run for a few days, I think, maybe a week. And they wanted to see what happened. Now, I think they didn't think much would happen. So they were very surprised when they started to see organic molecules form in the samples pretty quickly. The solutions changed colors. I think it got like a dark red color. And when they tested this solution, it contained all kinds of carbon-containing compounds, including many of the amino acids that proteins use. So that was really amazing. The molecules of life can be formed through physical properties in conditions that might have existed in the early atmosphere. How about this idea of compartmentalization? It has been shown that vesicles do form spontaneously if there are molecules in the environment like phospholipids. They will spontaneously form vesicles. And so there have been lots of experiments showing this in different conditions. You don't need to know the details of all the different ways that these kinds of vesicles can form. But if you put phospholipids in water, they do spontaneously form bilayer vesicles. I think in class I said a single layer. Checking that more carefully, they do form bilayer vesicles, which is what you would expect because phospholipids are amphipathic. And so the only way for the tails to be separate from the aqueous environment is if they form a bilayer. And so maybe phospholipids existed in the environment at that time. Maybe they formed through processes similar to those that were tested by Miller and Urey. And if they did exist, they would form these vesicles. We know that because we see them form vesicles today. Maybe they were different molecules, but as long as they were amphipathic, it's likely that that would have occurred. So what was the first replicating molecule? So we've showed we can get carbon compounds, we can get vesicles that can create a separate environment. Now we need something to replicate that can carry information. Today we use DNA. It's thought that the first replicating molecule was not DNA, but was RNA. So the reason for that is because DNA is complex, and specifically it needs enzymes to be replicated. But enzymes are produced using genes found in DNA. So how can you get DNA if you need enzymes, but you need DNA to make enzymes? It's like a chicken-egg problem. So it's thought that it's not likely that DNA was the first genetic material. It's thought that it was RNA because RNA can store genetic information, but it also can fold into a three-dimensional shape. So this image next to me is a folded up piece of RNA. And when RNA folds up into a three-dimensional shape, it can do similar things that proteins do today, right? The shape can catalyze chemical reactions. And we know this because there are still RNA molecules that do act as enzymes today. So most enzymes are proteins, but some are made of RNA, and there's a specific kind of enzyme called a ribozyme made of RNA. It's found in the ribosomes. Okay, those words sound similar. Try not to mix them up. And what the ribozymes do in the ribosomes is they catalyze the formation of peptide bonds when polypeptides are made from amino acids in the cell. So we know these things exist. So maybe RNA was the first genetic material, and maybe it was able to catalyze its own replication. Okay, so we sort of have a hypothesis of the things that may have had to have occurred for the first life forms, first cells, to have formed from non-living material. A lot of those ideas we have tested. So we've shown that they're possible. It doesn't mean that's what did happen. We're just able to show that, okay, this is possible. This could have happened. What is the evidence? So that moving on now, life did evolve. We know we're here. Are we all related? Do we share a common ancestor or not? It seems very likely that all living things today, that exist today, descended from the same common ancestor. So we're all related. We're all cousins. We can call that common ancestor the last universal common ancestor, abbreviated LUCA. And there's lots of evidence for that. So one piece of evidence is that we have a universal genetic code. So the way we translate genes into proteins is the same for every living thing. So that's very unlikely if it just to occur randomly, right, or through some convergent evolution. It's very unlikely that we would all share that genetic code. There's many ways a genetic code could be organized. So the most likely explanation is that the reason we all share the same genetic code is because we got it from our common ancestor. The other thing is a lot of the genes that we have are very, very similar, if not identical, among different organisms. So there's certain things that are important, like genes that are involved in forming ribosomes, or genes that are involved in replicating DNA and RNA, that all living things share with only very minor differences. How can we explain that? The most simple explanation is that we all share those genes is because we got them from our common ancestor, LUCA, when he first formed. Now, be mindful that that doesn't mean that other life forms did not evolve. It's very likely that many life forms evolved initially and changed over time, but they just went extinct. So that all living things today share the same common ancestor, but maybe there were living things that existed in the past that had a different common ancestor. That's possible and likely. I just put this here to remind you of what the genetic code is. I think students sometimes have a vague idea of what it is, but not a clear idea. We haven't done protein synthesis yet. That's coming up, but these two diagrams show the genetic code, exactly what it is. So the three letters like UUU or UUC or UUA, those are RNA bases, right? Uracil, cytosine, so on. And they're arranged in threes. They're called codons. And three bases in RNA code for a specific amino acid. So UUU is always phenylalanine. It always codes for the amino acid phenylalanine. And there's another way to code for phenylalanine. You can do UUC as well. So there's like 64 codons, I believe, and there's 20 amino acids. And so some amino acids have up to 4 ways of coding for it. So those are some of the details of the genetic code. But the point here is every living thing uses this same code, this same conversion table. It's the same for me, for you, for trees, for fish, for bacteria, for archaea, and so on. So there's a lot of evidence that we all share a common ancestor. When did that ancestor exist? Well, a long time ago. One reason it's hard to sort of imagine the evolution of life is because it happened a long time ago and over a long time scale. A much longer time scale than obviously an individual human's life, but much longer than humans have even existed. So for our minds, we don't exist at that time scale, right? We live a very short time. So it's hard for us to comprehend things that happened a very long time ago. But we have some evidence that Luca evolved about 3.5 to 4 billion years ago. And how do we know that? Well, we have fossils. And so there are these things called stromatolites, and that's what that picture is underneath me. The ones that are described in the book are the Strelly-Pool structures. And it's been shown that they're 3.42 billion years old. So these are produced by living things. They're produced by bacteria, a kind of bacteria called cyanobacteria, photosynthetic bacteria. And this kind of bacteria forms colonies. So they come together in large groups. And when they're in these large colonies in shallow water, they trap sediment. They secrete calcium carbonate, so they make these structures called stromatolites, and those can fossilize. And then we can, using methods in chemistry, we can find out how old those things are by looking at radioactive isotopes. So we know they're made by living things, and we know how old they are. So that provides some evidence for when, at least when life did exist. We know there was life 3.42 billion years ago. We can look to other evidence, including this radioactive isotopes. So there's different forms of carbon. So all living things have carbon in it because our molecules have lots of carbon in it. But there's different isotopes of carbon. There's carbon-13, there's carbon-12 that exist in the environment. In living things, the ratio of carbon-13 to carbon-12 is lower than in non-living things. We know that by looking at living things today. And so there's sort of this signature of life. A low carbon-13 to carbon-12 ratio is considered a signal of life. It came from living things. So when we look at rocks, we can find out this ratio of isotopes in those rocks. There's ways to do that. And we've found rocks that are as old as 4.1 billion years old that have this kind of ratio, suggesting they came from living things. They're not a fossil, they're just a rock, but it suggests the rock is the product of a living thing. It contains elements, bits of living things that existed a long time ago. And we've shown they're 4.1 billion years old, so that suggests that maybe life existed before 3.42 billion years ago. We can also look at living things today and look at their genomes, and we know that genomes change over time through mutations, and there's a certain rate that changes happen. So it's sort of like a clock. And so if you compare any two species that exist today and look at the differences, you can calculate how long ago their common ancestor existed. So more differences would mean the common ancestor existed further back in time. And so by doing this kind of analysis, by looking at genetic differences among organisms, comparing bacteria and humans and fish and fungi and so on, it looks like Luca lived 4.5 billion years ago, so even older than the rocks suggest. And that's sort of surprising because it's very shortly after the Earth formed. So it feels like the spontaneous formation of life would be quite difficult, but the evidence suggests that it actually happened relatively quickly, considering the Earth formed around 4.5 billion years ago. And genetic evidence shows that Luca existed then. Okay, we're nearing the end here. Where did Luca evolve? Where did he exist? One hypothesis is that he evolved around these areas called hydrothermal vents. And so this is a hydrothermal vent. So they're in the ocean. There are places where cold seawater penetrates into the seabed, to the rock under the sea, and it gets heated up because the magma, it gets close to the magma, it gets heated up. Various substances are dissolved in it, and reactions occur, and this sort of heated, super hot solution, aqueous solution, spews out, and it looks like smoke. It's not smoke, it's just very hot water, and it forms these structures, these sort of chimney-like structures, and there's a lot of interesting chemistry there, and it's thought that that is where life may have first evolved. So what's the evidence for this? One is bacteria and archaea contain genes, and we think the first life forms were similar to bacteria or archaea, or a sort of a combination of both. So when we look at the genes in bacteria and archaea that they share, suggesting that they got it from a common ancestor like Luca, we look at them, and those genes code for proteins that are necessary for a kind of metabolism, anaerobic metabolism, so no oxygen, in environments like those found around hydrothermal vents. And so we find these proteins, these genes that code for proteins, when we look at bacteria and archaea, and all of them have them, so that's probably what Luca had. And these proteins are perfect for metabolizing the chemicals found around hydrothermal vents, for using them as an energy source. So chemicals like iron sulfide and hydrogen and methane and ammonia, which exist around hydrothermal vents. The genes to make the proteins that can metabolize those chemicals, use them as an energy source, all bacteria and archaea have. So that suggests that maybe Luca existed around these hydrothermal vents and was using those inorganic chemicals as an energy source. And we do have some evidence of this beyond the genes. There's also fossilized microorganisms, and it's thought that they came from hydrothermal vent areas. So looking at this abstract there, you can see some of these fossils are 3.7 billion, so 3,770 million, or 4.2 billion years old. They were found in Canada. And so again, all of this evidence is pointing to this time shortly after Earth formed, that life first developed. Okay, that is the end of this video. I hope it was useful. Thank you.